Perhaps one of the most interesting dualities of the human species is our ability to be great engineers and scientists on the one hand, but our utter inability on the other hand to fully understand and implement personally, individually, in our lives, those discoveries that we make as a potentially quite logical and creative species. In this modern age we can see the great advancements made by humanity in the technological arena. All you need to do is look around and see the great technological marvels that humanity has created in order to try and better its life condition. Our houses, our cars, our bridges, our computers, our growing prowess at creating functional navigation systems that are even beginning to break free from the great gravity of this planet. There is genius in us, true magic that is able to pull from the ether the great spark of creation, and that is then able to logically, sequentially, with great discernment, and with a deep knowledge of the laws inherent in our dimensional reality, our logic, put together incredibly complex machines, cause and effect droids of ever-growing complexity that are even developing a kind of self-understanding, which are beginning to allow us to challenge many of the barriers that have imprisoned us to the inherent dimensional laws of this physical dimension. And yet, for all that incredible engineering prowess, we seem to find it impossible, or at the very least very hard and seemingly beyond our current mental understanding, to be able to use that same engineering prowess to be able to fix ourselves, fix our own flawed psyches. We seem to be a species that can create incredibly advanced transportation vehicles, for example, that can carry us across land, sea and air, that are beginning to develop a kind of artificial intelligence so that in the future they may even be able to drive themselves anywhere. And yet how odd it is that we need those vehicles to drive themselves, not just because this is more convenient, but because of a seeming flaw in us that makes us petty, cruel at times, frightened, and basically, dangerous to ourselves and others. An odd inherent nature within us that can cause us to do the silliest things, that can cause strife upon ourselves and others, that seems to impel us to take those vehicles and abuse them, and use them to cause pain upon ourselves and others. We seem to need to be rescued, to rescue ourselves from ourselves with our technology. That is the conundrum. We are a species that has the potential to create marvels when that spark of genius is harnessed properly, which can be a difficult thing in and of itself because of that pettiness in us, that need for profit and domination, that inherent psychological stupidity in us. We are a creative and intelligent species, but we can at times use those windows of technological opportunity, those sparks of genius, to create more strife and dark dominion over ourselves and our fellow beings, instead of doing the truly logical thing, the truly worthy thing of such marvelous engineers, which is to break free of all bonds, even the bonds of dark egoism, and strive evermore for new vistas, new challenges worthy of us. Part of that engineering marble and magic, for example, tells us, has proven to us, that there is this inherent transmutation that is happening to all things on this planet. That this progressive transmutation might be easier to perceive in biological organisms like ourselves, but that it seems that all of the things on this planet are in a constant state of transmutation, of motion and change, of manifestation towards different states, most oftentimes more refined states. As our technological and logical structures have grown in complexity, we have started to call such a thing evolution, and due to that same increase in our ability to understand more and more complex logical structures, we have let go of the simplistic ideas about how that evolution happens through simple natural selection, and have begun to understand that evolution, something which alchemists call transmutation, is the result of very complex open systems, mathematically chaotic systems, that contribute in allowing for certain, potentially favorable changes that can happen generationally or within the lifetime of a certain individual structure, and that these changes are not happening to just biological organisms, but that they are also happening to the geology and the cosmology of our physically perceived universe. Now, there are of course many diverging theories as to how this transmutation happens. From a purely physics point of view, there is such a thing as entropy, which erroneously, at least in accordance with the direct energetic perceptions of inner alchemists, posits that our great universe is a closed system and that everything is moving slowly from order to disorder, or from an agitated state that is full of energy, to a state that is slowly losing energy and agitation. Inner alchemists can see that this universe is not a closed system and that we are constantly gaining and losing energy across dimensions, that are themselves access points and accessed by dimensions that are more dynamic still, so that there is not only energy leaving the system but also great quantities of energy being introduced into this system, meaning that at least in accordance to inner alchemists, there is no such thing as some quiet end for the universe, but that the universe is indeed cyclic and multidimensional, with constant and never-ending bursts of creation and vacuums of annihilation. According to modern theories of physical reality, and according to the perceptions of inner alchemy, evolution is happening now, and it is happening to all matter. The difference between inner alchemy and modern theory, modern science, is that one posits that there is a never-ending cycle and the possibility to transmute even beyond this dimension, while the other posits that this is a closed system that must eventually come to a grey goop-like finality. In order to simplify this video from a theory of change perspective, so as not to make this video a debate about the nature of evolution or transmutation, I can say that from the inner alchemist's perspective only, we are indeed evolving, that we are transmuting into a finer essence from an energetic point of view, but that the nature of that transmutation is a complex one involving many components, some of which cannot be perceived physically, even by current physical instrumentation, and that due to the complexity of these counteracting forces, the great pressures brought to bear upon humanity are incredibly powerful, diverse, beyond calculation at times, and intricate beyond current models. Like a cauldron generating massive amounts of heat and pressure, this complex system that is forging us into a finer essence of ourselves has the potential to destroy us as well. It has the potential to create a finer essence of us, and it also has the potential to revert us back to a coarser essence. Let me begin by explaining what the nature of this transmutation, this evolution, means for us as a human species in accordance with the seeing of inner alchemists. Through their seeing, that is through their ability to see energy directly as it flows across the dark sea, inner alchemists can know directly in that fashion that the transmutation, the evolution of humanity, involves the ability of the individual and the mass of the species to be able to move across the complexity of the systems that it is a part of, and in doing so gain complexity itself, which means gaining the ability to become more aware, and be able to have greater ability to work with energy. Using terminology that might be understood by both inner alchemists and my readers that are aware of some of the techniques used by inner alchemy, this next big step in evolution can be interpreted as moving from what could be referred to as the third room to the fourth room of the projectionist, as a quite conscious and physical operating theatre for humanity. To define this in a more precise way, you might say that humanity is moving from understanding itself as being a three-dimensional object within a three-dimensionally perceived space, which we can classify as a simple three-dimensional cube, the third room of the projectionist, to a fourth-dimensional fluidity, a new room, a new kind of cube that can break free and move beyond just 3 dimensions, and into a fourth one. This fourth-dimensional fluidity means that such an individual can go from knowing themselves as being a three-dimensional being, an object, within a certain point in space and time, in accordance with that dimensional understanding of a three-dimensional object, to a being that can begin to understand that there are more dimensions than just 3, and that the next dimension available to it, the fourth dimension, is time. And that within this new dimensional paradigm that opens up as the fourth room, such a being, and the mass of the species, is able to go beyond the constrictions of 3 dimensions and begin to incorporate time as a new dimension, that it can manipulate within, with greater and greater fluidity. We are a whole unit. This means that we are not just physicality, and we are not just psychology, but we are the sum of both, and of course, in accordance with the direct knowing of inner alchemists, we are far more than this due to the energetic fact that we are multidimensional beings that have barely begun to understand just how big we are inside. But going back to the general focus of this video, which is the next step in human evolutionary transmutation, I can describe the nature of this next becoming as being the ability of the human species to apply its ever-growing understanding of time within the machinations of an expanded understanding of causality, and apply that understanding to itself, to its psychology as a collective and as individuals. This increased causal understanding and complexity, which can be perceived outwardly, in a physical fashion as advancements in technological power, as we humans keep moving forward due to an ever-quickening technological revolution, these technological advancements must and do begin to expand the psychology of the species, being that our perceptions of space and time are expanding with increasing rapidity. We can take a plane and travel across half the globe, and in a matter of hours thanks to that technology, find ourselves in a vastly different position in space and time. This now possible experience can challenge classical human psychology and does indeed demand a mental evolutionary leap. As we use now easily accessible digital devices, and use one to contact someone that is far away from us, we are instantly transported that way to new locations, new times, new experiences that were impossible for humanity in the recent past, and again traditional psychology cannot account for this new spatial freedom, and must develop new compartments as it were, new modalities and models, internal and as yet unmeasured processes, to be able to deal with this growing expansion of experience, the ever-growing information that the modern self has access to. The creative spark of humanity seems to know no bounds, and this spark is increasing the complexity of our technological development at a cumulative rate. These are the outward manifestations of forces that have an inner origin, and these forces are speeding up. There is a quickening that is happening now. As these forces speed up, they are bringing humanity to a cusp where this understanding not only evolves the nature of our psychology, but also is beginning to transmute, to unlock, deep inner structures within us that are also beginning to make changes in the brain, in our biology, that will make the perception of the direct flow of time more and more possible as this quickening hits a kind of singularity point. Such an ability to perceive time in a more direct manner has always been a recessive capability in us to a degree, and it is indeed the case that all evolutionary possibilities available to humanity are recessive within us right now. Certain individuals that might have been termed psychic, or genius, have always been around in small numbers, and they do point to the potential in us that will become accessible to us as our technology and our evolving psychology push us to new heights. The ability to perceive the flow of time in a more direct and multidimensional manner has always been with us, and it will be possible for us to perceive and work with time in the future, in the same way that it is possible for us to now perceive clearly a physical cup that might have been placed on a table in three-dimensional space before us, and move and manipulate that three-dimensionally stable object. This recessive ability to perceive and work with the flow of time can be seen in a rare few, for example, and those people have always held a special status within human culture, being called seers, prophets, the genius, crackpots perhaps, or those touched by the gods. Currently, the mass of humanity has bound itself to only 3 dimensions. As such, it sees itself as an object, as a stationary and stable hard thing placed within a 3-dimensional coordinate that is bound to those 3 dimensions, an object that has one moment of inception and one moment of termination. But there is the possibility of an evolution beyond the 3 dimensions, beyond the one here and now perspective only, and it is that jump beyond those 3-dimensional coordinate points into a 4th dimension, into the 4th room, which will make available the coordinate of time, that will represent the next major step in evolutionary human psychology, and then bring about actual physical change in the biological brain of the species. This psychological change, by the way, has already begun, due to the fact that in the recent past we have referred to the ability to see the flow of time as being either just outright delusion, or when we are being more charitable as being psychic, as an occult ability. It is easy to dismiss the nature of this coming transmutation as impossible or highly unlikely, due to the fact that being stuck within 3 dimensions, the 4th dimension of time, while perceivable to some degree, seems from that 3-dimensional point of view to be something completely out of human possibility. We may now know time and measure time, use the measure of time far more effectively than we might have 50 years ago, 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, but what is to come is far beyond this using of time as a ruler to understand possible probability. As such, it becomes easy to dismiss the already expanding psychological evolution and understanding of relative time that has already begun, that has begun to expand the complexities of our human logic due to our advancements in technological prowess. But it is the case that this rapidity in technological advancement is already changing people far more than some might suspect, and indeed the psychology of the race is permanently changed due to the technological advances mentioned. And as this new psychology evolves, these new psychological transmutations will become so complex and groundbreaking from a mental point of view, that the nature of the human cerebral changes that are happening now and will continue to happen will be beyond doubt, and it will be at that point, with this ever-quickening physiological development, that modern scientists will finally admit to and begin to easily measure using their acceptable instrumentation of the times, the mental and physiological changes in the race, as new hormonal levels will be established and hitherto unused organs within the brain will seem to become active to one degree or another. That rational monkey mind that I speak of at times, which is the greatest gravity, the greatest downward pressure that is affecting the evolution of the human species, which I have also termed the cloud of the archon, makes it very difficult to discuss the nature of this evolution, especially if we are to describe it in the only way possible, which at this time in history may involve such occult terms as psychic, precognition, or multiple personalities even. But nevertheless, it is this understanding of time and the ability to work with time in a more direct fashion, in a flowing multiple states fashion, which to the inner alchemist represents a functional movement into the fourth room, that is the basis of the next step in human evolution. We are quite simply moving from the third room of the projectionist to the fourth room in a way, and by doing so we are letting go of not only our psychological idea of us being objects within a limited three-dimensional space, but also our very limited idea of our ego self. Now, it is very important for me to point out that this has nothing to do with the loss of our currently perceived individuality, being that individuality does continue. Indeed, it expands to a far greater level than it is now understood. So, in that sense, individuality is not lost. Instead, the nature of the ego is expanded upon, and that ego that has flourished in three-dimensional space, in the third room of the projectionist, is not left behind, but it is allowed to expand far beyond current possibilities, so that in some ways it is able to pursue not just one but a number of possible potential futures, that is, it is able to pursue multiple timelines at once in a way. It can access multiple space-time coordinates simultaneously. It can begin to see also that the blurring between the subjective and the objective are illusions, and that the inside of us has more connection to the outer physical world than we might have suspected. And as the individuality expands in this fashion, a new ego develops that is far more flexible and can begin to partake in multiple lines of potentiality at the same time, and in this way perceive the flow of time, work with it, and use that new psychological and indeed biological development that is coming, to move into new dimensional territory that has hitherto been impossible for most of the species to even conceive of. But as I have said, all transmutation holds within it risk. All evolution posits that while some may evolve, others may be left behind or may even devolve in a certain fashion. And as such, this new apocalypse, this new revelation that is happening, this quickening that can be perceived by the physical senses as the increasingly creative spark within humanity to develop new forms of technology, that has to some who understand the doubling and the flow of information been referred to as the coming singularity, will mean that some of us will go through into a new dimensional possibility, into a fourth room, while many others may choose not to go in this direction. Or may choose to go in this direction but in a different fashion, a more technological fashion that may mean digital cerebral augmentation as opposed to purely biological change. This does not mean some annihilation, some typical science fiction war or doom, but simply a separation, a true separation of the species as some move in one direction while others choose to follow another. And that separation will not even be perceived at all by most, because using the physical senses alone, that separation which has already started, will only be apparent as a long and gradual transition away from the gravity of the planet itself, first as a spacefaring race and then as a multidimensional one. And yes, indeed, this transmutation from the third to the fourth room has happened before, many times before, in accordance with the direct perceptions, the direct knowing of inner alchemists, and it will continue to happen in the form of cycles that the species has gone through and will continue to go through over and over again. These are the cycles of transmutation, the cycles of time and change, and perhaps may be best understood as the Yuga cycles in Hindu cosmology or the Maya cycles of time, the long count calendar. If you would like to know more about the nature of the forces that are causing this transmutation, this evolution, that are at times helping and at other times hindering, that is applying pressure and ultimately in one way or another therefore helping to create a finer essence out of the human race, forces that I have sometimes referred to as the dark cloud of the archon, I would suggest the trilogy of course books that are made up of the magnum opus, The Way of the Projectionist, and The Way of the Death Defier. In those course books, I will not only explain the nature of this paradigm of transmutation in accordance with the way of inner alchemy, but also explain in step-by-step detail how the rooms of the projectionist work, and how they can lead to new dimensional possibilities even beyond the next step in human mass evolution, into even more expanded possibilities beyond physicality altogether, past the life and death cycle. I will leave a link to this trilogy of course books in the video description below.